Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
Our story begins in a little school called SUNYIT in upstate New York about 5-6 years ago. A state-run school that they tried to peddle as an institute of technology. This was a school that only had wireless in one building out of 6, had IT equipment from as far back as 1972, according to the date stamps, and professors who were uncaring part-timers, or in my case, senile. I was in what was called an experimental course, which meant it would count towards my degree, but would be non-transferable. We were required to take at least 4 of these 493 classes over the course of our attendance in order to graduate. It was nonsense. That was the rule. One of these classes was run by an elderly professor who was known for being intolerable, unrelenting, and literally a relic of the past. He constantly claimed he invented the token ring and how it was superior to Ethernet in almost every way. Every exam had a token ring-related question, and the only way to get a perfect score on that question was to perform academic fellatio and proclaim that the token ring was superior in that scenario because whatever. Very 2 + 2 = 5 if you get me. Now the class itself was a mix of foreign graduate students from India and undergrad students from New York. We were typically assigned group work, and the 6 of us from NY would work together, turn in our papers the usual, and the graduate students would do the same. For the final project, the professor decided that the undergraduates could learn better if they worked at the graduate level. So the normal teams were split up, and I was put on a team of all Indian graduate students. We were given 6 weeks to invent a product and apply previous coursework and knowledge into making the product more technological. An example would be a lawnmower that you could control via a cell phone. We could simply say it was a lawnmower, but we'd have to explain in detail the protocols used over the network, encryption, error control, how it would handle signal degradation, etc. Very challenging, and yet a great way to show off what I've learned so far. Furthermore, we'd all have to grade each other in evaluation forms and get the other teammates to sign off on it. So if you wanted to give someone AC, you'd have to explain to them why you graded them that way. I was not a fan of this, as I felt it was the professor's job to grade us, not our fellow students. He was outsourcing his duties, but the chair of the department was new and didn't want to mess with a tenured teacher. This was the hand I was dealt. The first meeting my team had was lacking, to say the least. The graduate students contributed nothing. One of them worked on a paper from another class, and the other 2 were just chatterbugs. Any idea I had, they instantly approved of. Felt good the first few times, but as time went on, it became apparent I was the only one doing the work. This pattern continued into week 2 and 3, and I finally said I couldn't make it anymore due to scheduling conflicts, and we'd collaborate online via email. Of course, the grad students thought this was a great idea, and we didn't meet in person again, except in class, as dictated by the professor. By week 4, I had done what I felt was my part of the work. I'd written 8 pages of content describing how the product would work, its practical purposes, how it would communicate over RFID, etc. The only thing I couldn't get my head wrapped around was the high-level stuff like error correction, signal drift, and that sort of thing. Math was never my strong point, but the grad student said it would be no problem. I thanked them, told them exactly what needed to be done, and even highlighted the important parts of the paper for them. At most, they'd have to write 1 page each to supplement my 8. They were getting a pretty sweet deal, and I was going to get to graduate. Win-win, I thought. Week 5 comes around, and I'm expecting the email with the completed paper. There wasn't a whole lot of email traffic, none to be exact, for the past week. I sent out an email asking for a status update since the paper is due next week and will all fail if we miss the deadline. The final paper represents 40 of the final grade. I got an email 2 days before the deadline that we all need to meet in the library to finish the paper, and they've been really busy with other coursework. At this point, I'm more nervous than angry, as my butt is on the line and can't afford to fail a class and miss graduation. We decide on a time, reserve a room, and meet. They had literally nothing to show for the past 5 weeks. I know people on Reddit exaggerate the word literally a lot, but I can't overemphasize this enough. Nothing. I explained the situation we were all in, and how we'd all fail if we blew this, but they were cocky and sure that he'd never fail them, and they've had him before, etc., etc., etc. Excuses. They wanted me to bet my degree on excuses and false hope that was backed by nothing. After the meeting, I went to meet with the professor. At this point, I'm more scared than anything else. Too scared to be angry, but it was still there, and incredibly nervous that the old man wasn't going to budge. Sure enough, he didn't. I explained my case, showed him all the work I did, described every aspect of the project to him verbally, to prove I made a full and honest attempt to get this done. but my teammates were holding me back. 80 of the time, he didn't even look at me. Just kept repeating that this is what the real work world is like, and this sort of thing will happen in real life, and I need to find a way through it, and all other sorts of useless guidance. In effect, I wasted at least an hour of my life in his office. The depth chair had an office in the same hallway, a few doors down. Having no other options, I just sat down in the hallway against the door waiting for him. People would pass by and look at me. Some would smile. Most didn't. A college student sitting against an office door in a hallway reeks of desperation and hopelessness, which sums up the entire college very nicely in retrospect. After what feels like forever, the department chair arrives, lets me in, and says I have 20 min before he has an appointment downstairs. So make it brief. I gathered my thoughts and made the same case I made to the professor. How I was being sabotaged by my teammates, and the professor refused to hear me out. At one point, I challenged the chair about why I'm not going to be graded on my merits and knowledge, but rather who I was associated with involuntarily to begin with. Finally, he had to dismiss me from his office to get to his meeting, but told me he'd look into this and shook my hand. No commitments, no promises, just a handshake. Deadline. The different teams present their products, and the professor does his interrogations in a way that makes the trolls of Reddit seem like enlightened scholars. He used his 30 years of experience to effectively shoot down everyone on every team in any area they felt they adequately covered. Hypothetical situations and impossibilities of costs and scale that turned what was at first a fun project of theory, crafting with field-specific knowledge into what can only be described as technical draft reading in front of a one-man firing squad. Then the dreaded moment arrives when my team has to present. We get to the front of the class and know what's coming our way. My seated classmates all had the look of exhaustion and defeat on their faces, and I knew I'd soon be one of them. At this school, you got used to being beaten. To give you all the scene, I'm a 5'9" skinny white kid, next to 4'6" tall Indians who each had at least 30-50 LBS on me. So, I'm the runt of the litter up there. I pull out my 8 pages and start reading. Don't even get off the first page before the professor starts poking holes in individual statements. I politely asked him to hold all questions until the end, so I wouldn't lose my place on the paper, and because I hoped he'd forget most of them by the end, which he agreed to and smiled. Then he walked up to his desk, got a pad of paper and a pen, sat back down, and told me to continue. I smiled at him, because it's all I could do in that moment of defeat. Instead of taking small beatings along the way, I was going to get destroyed by a barrage at the end. Jumping out the window looked like a good option at this point to second floor, so I'd live and probably be able to hobble off with the sprains. By the time I got to the end of page 8, he was on page 3. My classmates had looks of fear and shock when they saw him turning over page after page to jot down notes and questions. For an old jerk, he was meticulous. I'll give him that. So I get to the end, and I ask him if he had any questions he'd like to ask the group. At this point, I was the only one who'd said a word, so it was high time my other teammates chimed in to help. His questions were just as sharp and pointed as the ones he asked other teams. Very advanced, and frankly beyond my level. After he'd read a question, I'd call out one of the others and say, "That's an intriguing point you made, sir. I'll let our teammate explain that part of the product and hope it'll answer your question." I handed my pages to the teammate and let fate take its course. Now, we've all come across people who think they're great at bullcrapping, but really aren't. You let them dig a hole for a while, then fill it in with them at the bottom. The professor did exactly that. He set them up, gave them a length, then yanked the leash back and called them out on their misunderstanding of the topic or the product or the part of the course that explained it. Each question I directed to another teammate, one after another. Number 3 tried to pass, but that just angered the professor, which made him even worse. He started calling out those 4 graduate students, asking them to describe certain parts of the product, which is what he was writing down on his pad of paper the entire time, not just questions. Number 4 tried defensive answers and stalling tactics, which again, just angered the professor. At the end, he threw us out of the class. I'll never forget that. He went on a 5-minute tirade of how we treated our final project like a joke. It was the worst presentation he'd ever seen in his history at the school, and how we should all be ashamed of ourselves if this was our best effort. I was already sweating bullets from fear and anxiety, and after that speech, I was glad to be the first one out the door. Skipped my other classes, went back to the dorm, locked myself in my room, and went to bed at 3. Didn't know what else to do, and I was mentally exhausted. That kind of exhausted where your brain just goes into shutdown because you can't figure a way out of a mess that you shouldn't have been in the first place. Didn't leave the dorm the next day, nor eat for 24 hours. I didn't even want to drink as I knew that'd make the depression worse. I'd have plenty of time for drinking after telling my parents I wasn't graduating. 2 days after the presentation, I got an email from the professor asking for a meeting in room 123, where room 123 was the chair's office. I accepted and arrived 5 minutes early, with both the professor and the chair already inside. We started early and got right to the point, with the professor looking right at me and asking what happened here as he pointed to my 8-page report on the desk. I explained it as best I could, the product, the function, the technology used, and then he stopped me. He didn't care about that. He wanted to know why I was the only one on the team who had an idea of what the presentation was about. The chair asked if I had bothered working with my teammates at all, since they apparently seemed clueless about what I was presenting about. Naturally, I denied the claim, opening my sent emails folder on my laptop to show all the times I reached out to them and how infrequently they replied. I told them about the in-person meetings in the beginning and how I only found out 2 days before the deadline that they weren't doing anything to contribute. I gently reminded them both that I was in their offices as soon as I found out where this was all heading, but I admitted that I should have kept a better track of their progress. I learned a long time ago that a little humility and admitting your own faults, no matter how small, goes a long way. The chair let out a huff of air through his nose and gave a look to my professor. I couldn't tell if it was contempt or not, but it made me feel slightly more at ease. The last question I got asked was if the packet of papers was all my original work. Did you write this? All of this solo? To which I replied that I had, except the one paragraph that I did a direct quote, but cited properly at the bottom of the page. Grades got posted the next week for all my classes.
I did decent, but knew I was screwed because of the 493 class. The grade posted, though, was a B.
I refreshed the page several times to make sure it wasn't a formatting problem with the site, a common problem back then, but the grade held. I stopped by the professor's office later that day after one of the other classes and asked why I got that grade. I explained that I had legitimately thought I had failed based on the final project. Apparently, the chair suggested that my team not be graded according to the previously mentioned system and be given grades directly from the professor, as is normal in every other class. My part of the work, while lacking in several areas, was acceptable for an undergraduate student. He admitted in plain English that he treats undergrads with more aggression because the world is not a nice place, and it's better you learn that lesson here where you can get back up after a fall. I told him I appreciated the hard lesson, but there might be better ways of going about it. He didn't care, and I wasn't surprised he didn't either. Turns out that I was not the only one they met with in the office. The graduate students were called in one at a time and were required to bring their parts of the project to the meeting. They all plagiarized. They were either too stupid or too lazy to even try and hide it. Grades got posted the next week for all my classes. I did decent, but knew I was screwed because of the 493 class. The grade posted, though, was a B. I refreshed the page several times to make sure it wasn't a formatting problem with the site, a common problem back then, but the grade held. I stopped by the professor's office later that day after one of the other classes and asked why I got that grade. I explained that I had legitimately thought I had failed based on the final project. Apparently, the chair suggested that my team not be graded according to the previously mentioned system and be given grades directly from the professor, as is normal in every other class. My part of the work, while lacking in several areas, was acceptable for an undergraduate student. He admitted in plain English that he treats undergrads with more aggression because the world is not a nice place, and it's better you learn that lesson here where you can get back up after a fall. I told him I appreciated the hard lesson, but there might be better ways of going about it. He didn't care, and I wasn't surprised he didn't either. Turns out that I was not the only one they met with in the office. The graduate students were called in one at a time and were required to bring their parts of the project to the meeting. They all plagiarized. They were either too stupid or too lazy to even try and hide it. The chair ran their papers, though, one of those plagiarism detection programs, and they all came back with a 90 certainty. One of them, I'll never know who, copied straight from Wikipedia, verbatim. Graduate students. He repeated his claim that it was one of the worst presentations he'd ever seen and how it was shameful. But this time around, I knew he was referring to the graduate students and not me. At the end of the meeting, I shook his hand not as a courtesy, but out of respect. His teaching style was unorthodox, but damned if it wasn't effective. I'll never forget the lessons learned from that class, and I don't mean the coursework. As for the graduate students, failed, each of them, and 2 more that weren't in my group. It was a mini scandal sort of thing on campus. Everyone in the major heard about it, and it was the talk of the dining hall for a couple of days. Because of the grades and the plagiarism hit on their record, they all lost their student visas. While I can't be 100% sure they were deported, the plagiarism charge means they can't come back to the school, and no other schools will touch them for at least a couple semesters. They can't get a job in the country without a valid visa either, so it effectively ended them. My degree hangs above my desk at home and reminds me of those hard lessons learned. I met an amazing mentor while doing my master's in the U.S. who hired me to work for a company where he was the coup after I graduated. I'm an immigrant to the U.S., so my visa is conditioned upon being employed, get fired, and I would quickly get deported back to the Middle East. The CEO of that company was planning on selling the company to a much larger British firm, so he wanted to maximize revenue in the short term so that he could get a better price for it. He also had a huge ego, and so did the sales VP. She was convinced that I was too young and inexperienced for my job and tried to sabotage me quite often. Part of my job was ensuring that we respected our terms of use for the data we bought from our suppliers. I would make sure that our customers used it in the pre-approved way, that the engineers used and encrypted the right data for each product, and that we reported usage and sales accurately so that the suppliers could bill us. Well, the sales VP and the CEO had approved a bunch of deals where they allowed a customer to use the data in a way that breached our supplier contracts and underreported sales to the supplier so that they could pad the company's revenue and get a bigger payout once they sold it. I brought it up to them because I thought they might have gotten the contract terms wrong at first, but they threatened to fire me and have me deported if I didn't go along. Whistleblowing would have just gotten me deported anyway since the suppliers were not based in the U.S. One of the suppliers asked to audit our reported sales data, but the CEO kept delaying the audit and hid it from the British firm who was going to buy us. I kept track of every single transaction they made in that way, however. After the British firm bought that company, I was one of the people they kept on because I was managing the product lines really well at the time. I got along with the new owners quite well. So when they decided to review the contracts and discovered the audit, I gave them every single file I had on those fraudulent transactions. The company had been in breach of contract with several suppliers, and I had the paper trail to prove it. The new owners immediately worked with the supplier to address the issue and reimburse them. They then claimed that this additional expense had been incurred before the purchase, since the audit predated it, deduced it and the revenue based on it from company's total value, and then took that out of the payout that they were supposed to give the CEO and VP. Those two assholes didn't make a single cent off of selling their company, and that's after they had worked on it for 6 years. Many years ago, I was a broke kid just out of high school who had no plans for college at the time because I was sick of school. I moved in with a friend, but he lived in what was an economically depressed area at the time with very few job prospects for a guy like me. I was young and willing to do just about anything for hourly work after 8 months of mostly being supported by my friend, like a real friend will do for you. I tried to apply anywhere I could, but almost no one was taking applications. I stumbled across an ad for a job in a construction-related trade, and at this point, I was ready to do anything to stop being a burden. There was no real interview. I was new, so I was going to start out making minimum wage and they would be able to give me cash, which was great since I didn't even have money to open a bank account. I thought that this probably meant it was an under-the-table type of job like the couple other crappy commission jobs I'd tried since I got there, but figured, screw it, at least I've got a job that pays hourly. The first day I show up to the shop at the scheduled time and they ask if I had my own tools. Of course not. I don't have any money. I had to borrow from my friend to get gas just to work the first 2 weeks. This was no problem, and they handed me a stack of new tools for my first day. I was also handed a time card and told to wait outside while each crew's supervisor was given their instructions. The supervisors gave us rides to the various job sites in the company vehicles. Everyone was told what to work on, and I was trained on what to do. My work was periodically checked by the supervisor. When the supervisor decided we were done for the day, we were all taken back to the shop, turned in any extra materials, and went home. And so it went every day for the next 2 weeks. If I needed a breathing respirator or eye protection, they'd hand it to me. Another tool? No problem. At the end of the second week, I confusingly received a check for my first week of work, and it was a lot less than expected. There wasn't an earnings statement, so I figured maybe I was wrong. They had taken out taxes. I was just happy to be able to pay for my own gas and take my friend to dinner as an underwhelming thank you. I asked them about the cash, and they promptly took the check back and handed me the amount. The next week, my check was a lot closer to the amount of money I expected, so they obviously hadn't taxed it. I was a bit confused, so I asked why my first check was short. That's when I found out I had bought all my supplies from them, and the money was taken out of my pay. I'd already seen one guy fired for questioning them on a job site, so I wasn't about to press the issue or ask more questions. Now, I'm not a stupid guy, and if I had more sense at the time, I would have run far away. I should have known better, but again, I was young, uneducated, had a job at a time that was hard to find one, and was finally able to pay my own way. Then I was stuck. I was working to make enough money to eat, have a roof over my head, and buy gas to get to work and earn another check. Sure, some of it was my own doing and wasting some money here and there, but the rent was almost 2 weeks' pay by itself. Car insurance, utilities, and a phone were most of another week of pay. Gas and food every week accounted for most of the fourth week of pay, and whatever was left went to liquor beer and small guilty pleasures. I say this only to illustrate the situation I found myself in, and why the last thing I was going to do was get up and quit my job. I tried to look for another job when I could, but unfortunately, when you're working a long distance from home, from early morning to late evening, including drive time and making just enough money to get by. You can't just take off work to go for an interview. This was my new life. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became a year. Over time, I came to find out who all my coworkers were. The meth heads, the alcoholics, the guys fresh out of prison who usually fit one of the two previous groups, even on probation, and a number of illegals. Some were assholes, the alcoholics. Some were really nice, the illegals. Some were just there to make it another week. Side note, before I get hate for using the word illegals, I don't hate illegals. Just don't bother trying to tell me they are undocumented because that is just a PC word for illegal. I had done some harmless but illegal crap in my past as well, but not been caught. So I wasn't one to judge them on an equally harmless act. These guys were almost all nice, friendly people, and I liked them. We were all just trying to get by. We talked about their living situations, how they sent most of their money back to their families, what family they had here, why they came illegally, so on and so forth. I laughed right along with their stories of the free vacations to see their families when they would be deported before hopping the border and coming back to work a couple months later. I also felt sad right along with them when they would tell me about their problems. The entire point is, this guy loved employing the type of people who wouldn't fight back about their crappy pay and who probably weren't going to file taxes. I had less than $100 saved at the end of the year and was about to learn what I'd really gotten myself into. In February, I was handed a tax statement, a 1099. I didn't think anything of it until April came around and I knew I had to do my taxes. I filled in the forms, used the tax tables, calculated things up, and in case you didn't know, when you get a 1099, you are working as a contractor, or basically you own your own business. Since you own the business, you not only need to pay your own taxes, but also all of the employer portion of the taxes on everything you made. I owed a couple $1,000s with almost nothing to my name. I just gave up. I already expected I was going to be a tax evader by taking under the table pay. There was no way I could make the payments for what I owed, so I just didn't file taxes. It wasn't long before I figured out that most of the other contractors were in the same boat, some of them for many, many years without filing taxes. 1 year became 2, 2 became 3. I hated that job and the guy we worked for. We were being worked into the ground for very little pay while the owner made money hand over fist. He would stretch the cheapest materials as far as possible. He made us buy our supplies and safety gear from him because if you didn't have it on hand, you were fired, and generally found any reason he could to keep money out of our checks. Overtime didn't exist because they considered us contractors. We had to work until they said we were done, based on the expectations they made on the supervisors. Because most of the guys were undereducated, illegal, or drug users, he knew they weren't going to say anything to anyone. By the time you account for all the tax burdens he transferred to us, we were probably making around $4, with supervisors making around $6. The third year in, I received a small amount of money unexpectedly. The job market was a lot better, so I applied for as many jobs as I could and lined all the interviews up for the next week. The money was enough for me to take that week off, and I lucked out with a new job. I quit immediately and started making a reasonable pay. When the end of the year rolled around, I had a W-2 and another 1099. I knew I had a problem. I started combing through our documents to figure out just how deep I was. Back file, pay penalties and interest, the IRS would keep all my taxes and I would still owe about $5,000, which I could make payments on. At my current pay and what I could afford, I would probably be making payments for at least the next 5 years with the interest. One day, as I was agonizing over the approaching deadline to file, one of the IRS documents sparked an important question. What made me a contractor? Turns out, according to the IRS definition, I probably wasn't, since I was told when I had to work, when I could leave, where to work, what to do. All work was supervised and training was provided. All these things added up to it looking like it would be determined I was an employee. Armed with this information, I filed my tax forms and immediately started a dispute process with the IRS. I made sure to be clear that all of the employees were in the same situation. At best, I hoped I would be just a little less screwed on how much I owed. Things worked out better than I had planned. The owner tried to dispute it, but my story was too compelling. The IRS found in my favor, and I was able to amend all of my previous returns. I still owed the penalties and some taxes for not having filed on time, but it was nothing compared to my old employer. He and his business were audited, then slammed with a ton of fines and penalties. His name and business were ruined. The last I heard, he was doing small, odd jobs. As an independent contractor, all I could think was, enjoy the taxes, you jerk. Preface. Going back to my college days, I was an executive member of a club. So whenever we had a large event that incurred some expenses, we can request the Student Government Association, SCA, to cover those expenses, and they will directly oversee and finance it if it is for a positive cause. For those that do not know, our club was among 56 other mini-clubs in the college, and SGA is the main student government body elected by all students. SGA gets a yearly budget allocated to spend for the student wellness or entertainment-related activities. The rule was after you provided all the proof, if the cost was $10. The check for that $10 won't be written to one person in the club. It will be written to all 4 executives of the club. $2. $5 per person, so no one person can steal from that. In SGA, the treasurer, let's call him Scat, was not exactly a friend, but was friendly and known to some of us. Come to think of it, almost all of the members of SGA were known or otherwise friendly to us. After all, we all had to work together. Main story. So it was summer of 2007, just finished the spring 2007 semester, and with it, our club held the biggest cultural event of the year in our college. It did cost some good amount, and of course SGA agreed to oversee the finance. At that time, I was going through some personal problem and angrily kind of ran away from my house, stayed with a friend for that duration. For a few days, despite not having my personal finances sorted, after the end of the show, SGA mailed out the checks to 3 other club executives for the costs of the show, but I did not get one, the $1/4 that I was responsible for. At first, I thought since I'm not at the address that they may have mailed it out to, maybe they sent it and I'm not there to accept it. A few days later, another executive of the club calls me and calls other executives and members to a meeting. We meet there, and this guy says, I got the news. The 4th check that you were responsible for had been accepted and cashed. I was in shock. Now, my friends were thinking that since I'm having financial difficulties and ran away from my house, I must have cashed the check and not admitted it. They are essentially accusing me of stealing. Looking back, if it was someone else in my shoe, I would have done the same. Then right away, I go to the college gay office to get to the bottom of it. They produce a copy of the check and other paperworks, and it shows it was not mailed, but instead it was picked up from SCAT. SCAT made an exception, and instead of mailing, let the person pick it up. The paperwork shows that it contains my name as the person who picked it up, but the signature suggests some other name. You have to print your name and then sign it. Then the copy of the cash check was produced from the bank. It shows some other name, and I knew who it was. I call all of the club executives and members for other off-site meeting and have someone else call the SCAT there under a different pretense. Armed with all of the proof, I go there to meet this SCAT, and he was surprised to see all of us. I just had to make it extremely dramatic as only 2 other people of about 10 met us there. Knew what I had in the paperwork. Me. Hey, SCAT, I'm supposed to get the check for that 1/4 of the total expenses. Do you know anything? SCAT, I do not recall now, but I'm sure it was mailed out to you, as it was my last business process for the year. Me, are you sure? Because I did not get it. SCAT, hold on. Let me call the office. He calls, finishes his query. Yep. The check was cashed, and it shows that you picked up. So what's going on? Another member, looking confused, and tells me, then where's the money? You said you did not get it. Did someone steal it? Me, that is what we're here to find out. Now, I produce all of the paperwork and point to the SCAT me. Is this a real copy of proof of the check acceptance from your office? SCAT, yes it is. And it shows that you have accepted the check. Me, so is this your signature that shows that I accepted the check from you? SCAT, yes. Me, but you said you mailed it. SCAT, I do not remember every tidbit now. Me, okay, so this signature on the check acceptance form, does it say my name? The acceptance signature was distinct enough to make out the person's name. SCAT is quiet. Everyone says no. Me, hold on. That's nothing. Here is the proof of the cash copy of the check. Whose name is this? And whose signature is this? SCAT gets up by this time and attempts to punch me. Tells me, are you calling me a thief? Me and a few others get up and say to SCAT, seat your ass down and do not try to even touch me. You know I will waste you. He knows I am well versed in self-defense since I told him previously, in an unrelated prior conversation, why I thought this line mattered in my head was he was 6. 2 185-old. I am 5, 8, and way less than 150-old. Tell me, what's the name here? Other executives and members that initially accused me says, the name here clearly says Gat's wife. Me. Boom. I rest my case here. SCAT is in full denial and still attempts to shift the blame on me. But at this point, our other executives have decided that I was of course not the bad person here, and since the SCAT was in the country on student visa, if we go to the cops, he will get deported. And so SCAT agrees to pay us up the next day as long as we do not call the cops, completely defeated and humiliated. He did refund us the money, and I did end up making an unofficial complaint to SCAT. They made him resign, and since there was no official complaint, they could not prosecute him. But after that, he lost all of his credibilities and always looked like a dirty little rat to us. Edit. Just adding a bit more detailed info here, about 6 months prior to that, he got married. We have called a wife in front of him and scolded her for it. Just spoke to a mutual friend, and he said Scat changed college after that, but mutual friend thinks our college may have booted him or something. The way we sort of ganged up on him, we were angry, wasn't exactly kosher. So calling the cops, especially when he returned the money, could have been counterproductive. Someone from our group actually slapped him.
And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching and see you next time.